As you would have heard yesterday, there's outrage in ecological circles and environmental circles, and the Greens have gone mad. Well, the ones that are left in the Greens caucus, to be fair, so many of them under investigation, suspended or facing criminal charges. You never know who's left, but apparently there's one left who's gone mad and is outraged about New Zealand government yesterday deciding to honour a coalition agreement and get rid of He Waka e Noa, which apparently means all in this together, just so you know, and revisit the idea of methane emissions and greenhouse emissions and how they should apply to the farming sector and obviously to the ruminant flocks that make up so much of New Zealand's GDP. Joining us to talk about that, Federated Farmers Board member and what happens next, much more importantly, Mark Hooper. Mark, welcome to the show. Love to have you on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Michael. It's good to be here.
You're not at field days. Is that sort of an act of almost sabotage and disloyalty and treason? I don't know.
To be at the field days?
Yeah, if you're a Federated Farmers meeting, isn't that compulsory? You've got to go there. It's sort of like a pilgrimage to Mecca or something like that.
Yeah, it is a bit like that, and especially this year with Federated Farmers setting up a new advocacy hub. And so I've just come out of a meeting which Minister Todd McClay officially opened that hub, and there's a whole bunch of MPs and dignitaries down there at the moment doing their thing. So quite important to be here, yes.
No, good on you. Tell me about the Advocacy Hub. What's that going to be about?
Well, it's a new initiative, and for people that have been to field days before, there's a number of different hubs where they get kind of similar groups. So there might be health and wellbeing hub, innovation hub, and such like. So you've got a number of exhibitors with similar themes all together in one place. Makes it a lot easier for people that are going around. And so Advocacy Hub, new idea. So just starting off first time this year, but a good bunch of groups in there. Federated Farmers, obviously, Groundswell, Rural Women, Fencing Contractors Association, quite a number of other groups that have all just come together in one place.
Now, I'm assuming, and you tell me, that the Advocacy Hub is also going to take a much more prominent role in public debates, because at the moment, let's just take He Waka e Noa as a good example, and yesterday's announcement on that, and we'll come to that in a second, but much of the media that's been generated has been from critical sources rather than from complementary. Are you going to take on those people who clearly have different political views and agendas than yourselves?
Well, I think the key thing here is, and Minister McClay just mentioned it a few minutes ago in his presentation, was that, advocacy is a critical part of the policy making process, and so that's why he was supporting it. He was there, keen to be engaged, as were the other MPs that are there. They recognise that ongoing sensible advocacy is a key part of the way that we make decisions, the way that democracy works. So that's the proactive side, but I guess, there's from time to time you've got to pick your battles in terms of, what do you push back on, and what additional value might you get from going hard on certain issues.
Well, let's go on this one, He Waka e Noa. Now, the last government started this, well, I guess it was meant to be some sort of all parties consultation and agreement about the path forward for reducing greenhouse emissions in New Zealand, and obviously identified agricultural emissions as a part of that process. There was questions about the science and about the validity of some of the assumptions that underlay the government response on that matter, and now yesterday Todd McClay and others put it out of its misery completely. Where to next, Mark?
Yeah. So I think it's worth just exploring that background there a little bit, because the He Waka e Noa, as it became called, was a collective agreement between the sector and government in order to price agricultural emissions, and primarily that was around methane emissions. And the threat that existed if we didn't go down that process, was that by the 1st of January 2025, agriculture emissions would be priced in the Emissions Trading Scheme, the ETS. And so that was part of a motivator for industry trying to come together to get an outcome. But in the end, it became clear that the legislative gross methane reduction targets that we have as a nation, if we were to achieve those, it would have a huge detrimental effect on our productivity in the ag sector. And that's at least in part the reason why the He Waka Eke Noa proposal fell over. And so what the government has, the current coalition government has done, is really all they're doing is just tidying up the rules here and saying, and it was part of their coalition agreement going in, saying, look, we'll remove that threat so that that's not hanging over us, that threat of pricing agricultural emissions just through the ETS. By removing that clears the air, and then we can start talking more sensibly without having this, kind of sledgehammer being held over us. So that's what they promised to do, and essentially all they've announced is what they said that they would do during the election campaign in terms of removing that threat.
So let me get this right. So agriculture, animal processors, I guess, like freezing works and the like, fertiliser companies, they all were going to be put in the ETS from January the 1st next year. Was that the intent?
That if that was the intent, if some alternative pricing mechanism had not been established, and that was what He Waka Eke Noa was designed to do, was it was to be the alternative pricing mechanism. It fell over, so the threat of going into the ETS did remain. Now, just be clear though, for those processes and stuff, we're just talking about primarily the biogenic methane emissions associated with the sector. So those kind of businesses that you just mentioned, they would have other non-biogenic methane emissions, which they would be priced through the ETS as per any other, purchaser of fuel or whatever in New Zealand.
Now, the Greens and others, of course, have said that this is some form of, basically ecocide that is being practiced, and that essentially this will not incentivise the destocking of New Zealand. I think those were the direct words, in actual fact, of their co-leader this morning. Your thoughts on that?
Well, this is what the fundamental problem is that we don't want to be destocking New Zealand. Sorry, just a moment. Sorry, I had another call coming in. It's beeping in my ear. So let's just pick up on that theme, because it's been a common theme. And if you think about the RMA amendment bill that's currently going through the House as well, that's similarly described as a war on nature. And this sort of has been portrayed in a similar sort of fashion. But in actual fact, what it is from this coalition government, it's more of a war on poor quality regulations. And so what they're doing is they're trying to tidy up some of these regulations that weren't actually working. And so this idea of pricing methane emissions by putting them into the ETS, for example, it was poor regulation. It wasn't going to work. It was a blunt instrument that didn't really address what the problems were. So by simply changing the legislation to tidy up the regulation, you've not necessarily gone backwards on anything. All you've done is you've taken out a rule that wasn't going to work anyway. So all it's done is just tidied up some anomalies there, really. And now the other thing is that, of course, in the interim time period, remember this was introduced in the Climate Change Response Act which was introduced in 2019, so part of the Zero Carbon Bill 2020. So we've sort of 5 years nearly has passed. And meanwhile, in that 5 years, there's been significant change in the approach that the industry, the sector, is taking to emissions, how they manage it, how big an issue it is going forward, and ways of addressing it. So we've moved on.
Now, although you, when I say you as a farming sector, have accepted that climate obligations to reduce emissions and meet that net zero target by 2050 is still live, in the meantime, people like me, who are not a farmer, and ordinary folk who aren't farmers either, one presumes are going to have to pay higher costs, are we, to meet the Paris targets and the obligations that the New Zealand governments of previous year have met?
Well, I guess I would argue it's the other way around, in that if we did introduce